This is a very serious work of scholarship. It's a narrative of the naval component of World War II, but it's written at what I would call a bird's eye or strategic level. I found that I needed to pay very close attention to what Paul Kennedy, the author, was saying in order to understand his perspective on the war. Frankly, I hope that some of it stuck and that it will give me a better understanding of the war and how all the various pieces of it fit together. He starts off the book with a couple of chapters that set the stage for the entire rest of it. First of all, he sketches the geographic and economic limitations that define the playing field for the participants. That enables him to provide a basis for understanding the strategy, the tactics, the weapon systems that were most appropriate for the places where this naval war was fought. His second chapter describes the development and the relative strengths at the start of the war of the principal navies involved. Of course, that involved the Germans, the Japanese, the Italians, the French, the British, and the United States Navy. Without a doubt, at the start of the war, Great Britain was the preeminent naval power in the world. At the end of the war, not only was the United States Navy number one, but it was larger and more powerful than all the other navies in the world put together. This book tells how all that happened. When he shifts to a narrative history of the war, he sort of uses two different dimensions. In terms of geography, he divides the naval conflict into three really big areas: the North Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific. The North Atlantic was important because it was necessary for the Allies to keep Britain alive, so as to furnish a launching point for the ultimate invasion of the continent. Now, in turn, that required the ability to secure shipping lanes from Canada, the United States, and South America. That was absolutely essential. And in this area, Germany had developed a weapon system, the U-boat, which was extraordinarily effective in disrupting those shipping routes. In fact, Germany had considerable success in the first half of the war. It was pretty much winning that until sometime in 1943. And Kennedy, of course, describes in some detail how the British were able to hang on by their fingernails to continue to protect these supply lines, of course with the help of the United States, and ultimately eliminate the threat in the North Atlantic. The second area he focuses on is the Mediterranean, and the issue there was similar in some ways to the North Atlantic. The British needed to defend Malta and to keep the Allied armies that were fighting in North Africa supplied. The difference from the North Atlantic was that both the Vichy French until 1940 and the Italians had very powerful naval forces in the Mediterranean, which were helped by some additional U-boats from Germany. The third area he looks at is the Pacific. Two main problems there. The first, of course, is that the Japanese started out the war with a very, very powerful and very modern navy. And they enjoyed really remarkable success in dominating the western half of the Pacific. And then overriding all of that, there was the sheer distances that the Pacific involved. I thought his treatment of the war here was a bit less detailed than what he did with the North Atlantic and the Med. Ian Toll, who really knows that part of the war backwards and forwards, says that he made a bunch of mistakes in his treatment of it. I'm going to take Ian Toll's word for it. I recommend that you take a look at Ian Toll's review of this book in the New York Times. It's not completely negative, but his criticism in terms of the Pacific is really good. But back to the book. When Kennedy applies a time dimension to these three theaters, the Allies on the whole were pretty much losing from, just say, 1940 through 1943. In the North Atlantic, Admiral Dönnitz's U-boats were racking up very impressive wins in terms of merchant ships sunk in the North Atlantic and on the east coast of the United States. In 1943, that turned around. Similarly, in the Mediterranean, after the British sunk the Vichy French Navy in 1940, the Italian Navy still posed a very significant threat, especially when coupled with some more of Dönnitz's U-boats. And in the United States, in the Pacific, the United States, with some notable exceptions, namely Midway and the Coral Sea, wasn't really making all that much progress. Well, in fact, we were stuck with only a single carrier in the Pacific until June of 1943. That was when the Essex arrived in Hawaii. By the end of 1943, the United States had 10 Essex-class carriers operating in the Pacific, with some more to come. And thereafter, the Navy was able to operate in huge task forces that ultimately drove the Japanese out of the Gilberts, the Marianas, New Guinea, and the Philippines. So now, in 1944 and 45, the trajectories in all three areas were completely reversed. He credits this turnaround to overwhelming technological and manufacturing capacity that the Allied powers had. It's simply dwarfed that of the Axis. Now, Kennedy's book, Engineers of Victory, explored all that in much more detail with great attention to 1943. My take on this book is that even though it's pretty challenging, I think it gives a really useful framework for giving the why behind the different strategies, tactics, and weapon systems that the different players were employed. And I say that recognizing Ian Toll's criticism. Now, to be fair, Paul Kennedy recognizes the fact that this war was won by men, not just factories and scientists, but his purpose in the book was not to get into the details of more than a handful of campaigns and battles. And he mainly gets into them to illustrate his main points. For my money, I continue to love books about individual commanders, battles, soldiers, airmen, sailors, the people who fought it. But, as I said at the outset, I think this book furnishes a really useful framework for understanding how all the moving parts in this relatively short war came together to produce an Allied victory, and maybe more important, left the United States with the most powerful Navy in the world. So there it is, Paul Kennedy, Victory at Sea. I'll see you next week.